I really like the idea of getting 3D printed muzzle flares and sort of shell casing ejections and things like that for my miniatures, because I feel that it'll bring a lot more life to them. And actually, I'm going to do a much longer video talking about this at some point in the future. But these are ones that I found from a company online. I got quite a few of them. Probably cost me about £30 in total. There are ones here you can't see as well. But as you can see, I just got lots of different muzzle flares, and then I decided that what I would do is find an appropriate miniature that I had recently painted. In this case, that is the electrified Power Fist Dark Angels Terminator, who has the assault cannon that I'm going to use as a test subject, because frankly, I couldn't find any Stormbolter muzzle flares. So this is the only guy from what I have recently painted that would really be appropriate for it. I chose one of the sort of muzzle flare effects from the pile that I had available that I thought would be most appropriate. In this case, I ended up going with this one. I just eyeballed this. I didn't have a particular plan or understanding, and I just thought, well, I'll give it a go and see how it turns out. Once I had decided on the one that I was going to use, I figured that I'd better pin it, because the gun flare itself is made of resin, and of course the model itself is made of plastic, so I'd have to use super glue to glue them together. Now, super glue is a powerful adhesive substance, but it also can be quite fragile, and I thought that if I drilled into both the flare and the gun barrel, and then put a little metal pin in, which is just going to be made up of the 0.35mm steel wire that I have, then it would be more secure. And after doing this, I have to say it does feel more secure, so I am glad that I did this. The process of drilling into the resin gun flare with the hand drill that I have took about 6 or 7 minutes in total, but because you've got to do it relentlessly for that time, it feels like it's longer. Don't push too hard on the resin, try and be a bit more gentle than you would maybe otherwise normally be, but eventually you get a deep enough hole in it and it should be fine. After that, I had to drill a hole in the barrel of my Terminator's assault cannon, and you may have watched my previous video where I said, try not to drill painted miniatures, because you're going to rub the paint off. Well, that meant I had to be very careful on this, and it took quite a lot of time. I learned from editing this video that it was about 10 minutes, so not that much time, but it just feels like a long time when you're continuously doing it. Anyway, after that, cut yourself a very short piece of wire that you're going to use to pin the muzzle flare in place, and then dab a bit of super glue on that wire, again carefully for all of this, just in case you needed to be reminded, and then carefully insert it into the hole in the barrel that you have made. Make sure it is reasonably straight, and then allow the super glue to dry. Once you've done that, clip the wire so it is very, very short, about short enough so that the muzzle flare and the barrel will be touching, and then glue the muzzle flare on. As you can see, for me, this just went straight on and was pretty easy to do. I didn't really have any problems getting this to hold and set. And once it was on, I was already thinking, wow, this looks pretty cool. I'm actually quite happy with this. This looks awesome. I could see it coming together really, really nicely. Already it made the thing just look slightly more alive. So the process of painting was quite simple. I just gave it a coat of white paint to begin as the undercoat that I was going to paint over, to make sure it's quite nice and bright, because of course you want the muzzle flare to look much brighter than the rest of the miniature. I also wanted the barrels to have a kind of heated glow effect, again, just to hopefully capture the essence of something happening at high speed and unleashing a lot of energy. But I've been told in retrospect that no, that's actually inaccurate. That wouldn't happen. What would happen is the metal would warp and break if it got that hot. To which I say, I don't care, rule of cool. But thank you for letting me know. But this was just watering down the white acrylic paint and then just dabbing it into the recesses of the assault cannon, just to create a kind of inner glow, or the area where the inner glow is going to be. You really don't have to be very neat and tidy at this stage, but just try not to get it on any parts that you've already painted, because then you'd have to go back and fix that paint job. Luckily, I was fairly disciplined with this, so I didn't see anything that I needed to touch up on the main of the model afterwards, thank God. Anyway, once I had undercoated those bits that I wanted to paint white, I decided to start from the darkest parts to the lightest parts, No particular reason for this, to be honest, actually, and it probably makes more sense to do the lightest parts to the darkest parts, but again, it doesn't really matter. You can do so many different layers of this, blending back and forth from one to the other, that by the end of it, it will have made very little difference. Anyway, what I'm doing here is taking some of Army Painter's Pure Red and desaturating and darkening it with their black, and then mixing that with water into a glaze. Now, the trick with the glaze is just don't have too much paint on the brush, and then glazing that onto the barrel over the metal parts and into where the dark red is going to begin, sort of showing where it's beginning to heat up. After that, I'm just beginning to glaze the lighter red colours, and as you can see, I'm testing out the texture and thickness of the paint on my thumb, because it'll just wash off next time I have a shower. But what I'm doing is seeing the opacity of the paint itself. As you can see on the thumb, you can see some of my skin under it, but you've still got a thin layer of red over it, so it's slightly translucent, and then just paint that further down the barrel until I get to the hottest parts. I did the same thing next with Lava Orange from the Warpaints Fanatic set. Again, nothing very complex or special, just glazing on layers of orange to make it look brightest at where I thought the most heat was coming from, as in the sort of firing chamber of the barrel, like the I assume this was the part of the gun where the bullets are being struck. The gunpowder is igniting, and therefore this would get the hottest, but like I said, I don't really know anything about guns, so whatever. And I also decided to paint a few layers of orange and yellow on the front of the barrel anyway. Just try and make it look like that was the flash was hitting that, because I think that it would have done. What I'm cutting out here, this whole process took a couple of hours, but what I'm cutting out are the repeated glazing layers that I ended up doing. And you'll have to do this over and over and over until you've got what you are happy with, frankly. Because as you can see, this initial orange layer is quite aggressive, and I'm not really happy with just how inconsistent and how bright it is. And so I had to go back and do it repeatedly and wipe off any smudges. So I was happy with the end result. And that's a very boring thing to watch, so I won't subject you to it, but you'll have to do it over and over and over, basically. So just get used to the idea. So at this point, I can't remember what I was using. I think I'm using the Two Thin Coats Yellow Glaze, which, as you can see, I've put between the barrels to emphasize the kind of heat of the glow coming from the inside, and to cover up all the white parts, so it looks kind of fuzzy, actually. And this ends up being a really easy part of the process and turning out really well. But as you can see, the yellow itself is a little bit bright, so I'll have to go over this afterwards with a slightly darker glaze just to tone down the colour a bit. Before that, I decided to use the yellow glaze on the muzzle and the muzzle flare itself in order to get the brightest point here. This is where the actual sort of explosion and flash is. So you want this to be as bright as possible, frankly. So I thinned down the yellow quite substantially, because what you want is really for this to be a kind of hint, a tone, rather than proper coverage. And also, when it's really thinned down, you manage to get it properly over the strange shape that is the muzzle flash. So as you can see, it's very spiky at different points. I went back and did some glazing on the barrels, because as you can see, I haven't spent any time properly sort of mixing the colours together. So as you can see, I'm just glazing on the sort of thin layers of the dark red to the lighter red to the orange to the yellow, and you can see that I'm toning down and glazing over some of the light bit between the barrels, just because you don't want it going all the way up. It looks unrealistic. And so I was putting that on and doing the barrel bit as well, the very sort of muzzle at the very end. I wasn't happy with that, so I had to go back and do that. As I said, this is a long process, and it took ages of just constant repetition until you've got a smooth enough presentation. For the details on the muzzle flare itself and the kind of OSL that I'm painting around it, the important thing is to make sure that the OSL is darker than the source of light, because light reflects at a lower intensity off of other objects. And so when painting the actual muzzle flare itself, it's tempting to take every single raised point and shade them into the darkest kind of red, because they're coming out of the explosion. But I think that's actually not the right way to do it. I think the right way to do it is to highlight them with orange, so they're slightly darker than the yellow core, but then save the darkening red to the end point of the muzzle flare itself. So that part is darkened, but the parts in the actual explosion are still quite bright. I thought the yellow in the muzzle flare was a bit dark, so I watered down some white, just pure white, and went on to dab it in the inner parts of the muzzle flare. I was hoping that what I'd be able to do is kind of smooth this and transition this into the rest of the yellow, so I wouldn't have to go over and give it another layer. But to be honest with you, when I'd finished doing it, I really wasn't very happy with it. So I had to go over and give it another coat of very thin down yellow glaze. To finish up, I just went over the other parts where the OSL was, again, sort of darkening them down a little bit actually, and making sure all of the transitions were smooth enough. And honestly, darkening down bits that you don't want to be bright is actually quite important. So anyway, this is what it looks like when it's done, and overall I'm relatively happy with it. It came out basically as I expected, which is all I could ask. I think it definitely helps the miniature overall, and really does help bring it to life. These gun barrel flares are really not very expensive to get, and it wasn't very difficult to put on, and it wasn't even designed for this miniature. If, for example, Games Workshop were to include some of these actually attached to the sprues that you could clip off and then plastic glue to the barrels of your guns, well, that would make them look a lot more exciting, because this, as I said, really does bring a lot of life to the miniature itself. And it's really helping inform my view of what a good miniature actually is. I've been working on this kind of small piece of philosophy for this, because actually the motion itself I think is really important, and is separating the good miniatures from the bad. But I'll do another video about that another time. Anyway, let me know what you think.